Now the document is, as I said, a large a large collection of specious arguments and spin. That's for obvious reason we cannot deal with every point in it in one lecture. Hopefully we will on the website, but there are a few themes in it to which I would like to draw your attention to, and I think these are important. The first is the target audience. The target audience, it appears that they have given up on me and you, on trying to change me and you, parents. Instead, the target now is primarily our children, the next generation. And she spells this out in plain English. She says, and I quote, "Committed adult adherence to radical Islam," and they call it radical Islam. In fact, what they mean is Islam, all Islam. Like Daniel Pipes said, that there are no difference, there are no moderates. They're all. As long as they own up to Islam, then they are all the same. So she's saying here, committed adults adherents to radical Islamic movements are unlikely to be easily influenced into changing their views. The next generation, however, can conceivably be influenced. So the plan is not for me and you, it is for our children. Now what she means by influence is getting them to accept the new religion she wants to create and then pinch the label of Islam for it. So in other words, she's into the business of prophethood rather than being a reformer. This one is even more ambitious. Yeah. In fact, she describes her work in the document, which is a 70-page document, as building a religion. She says, and I quote, "It is no easy matter to transform a major world religion. If nation building is a daunting task, religion building is immeasurably more perilous and complex." Obviously, she sees herself as a big pioneer. Nevertheless, this does not dissuade her. Obviously, she continues, and what she does is that she places 1.5 billion Muslims. We are all placed into 4 boxes. The box of fundamentalists, traditionalists, modernists, and secularists. These are the 4 boxes. And obviously people don't change as far as she's concerned. We have modernists, traditionalists, secularists, and fundamentalists. And of these 4 categories, only the modernists are given wholehearted membership in her new religion. And she does explain who the modernists are, which is very helpful. Modernists, in fact, she tells us what they believe, or what she would like them to believe in order to be acceptable to the West. Modernists believe that Islam is responsible for the underdevelopment of Muslims. Islam is responsible for the underdevelopment of the Muslims because prosperity and progress depends on modernity and democracy. Second point, modernists believe in the historicity of Islam, that Islam as it was practiced in the days of the Prophet reflected eternal truths as well as historical circumstances that were appropriate to that time but are no longer valid. This is an important one because I'll come back to it. It was appropriate to that time but are no longer valid. Again, she says, modernists do not regard the original Islamic community or the early years of Islam as something that we would necessarily wish to reproduce today. Modernists believe that some verses of the Quran, some surahs, may be falsely or inaccurately recorded in the Quran. And modernists believe that the Quran is legend, i.e. myth. Now, the second point I want to draw your attention to is that the document offers a list of practical guidelines of how she would achieve her goal. Her goal, obviously, is to reform, to create a new religion with the name of Islam. So she offers this she lays down the scenario through which, from where people could draw inspiration to set up their plans, the modernists. And she says, support the modernists. Under the heading of support the modernists, she says, publish and distribute their works at subsidized costs. Encourage them to write for mass audiences and for the youth. Introduce their views into the curriculum of Islamic education. Give them a public platform. make their opinions and judgments on fundamental questions of religious interpretation available to a mass audience in competition with those of fundamentalists and traditionalists who have websites, publishing house, schools, institutes, and many other vehicles for disseminating their views. Position secularism and modernism as a counterculture option for disaffected Islamic youth. Facilitate and encourage an awareness of pre- and non-Islamic history and culture in the media and the curricula of relevant countries. Assist in the development of independent civic organizations to promote civic culture and provide a space for ordinary citizens to educate themselves about the political process and to articulate their views. And then she goes on another set of guidelines. She says, support the traditionalists against the fundamentalists. Publicize traditionalist criticism of fundamentalist violence. Encourage disagreements between traditionalists. Discourage alliances between traditionalists and fundamentalists. And it goes on. It's lengthy. Anyway, encourage the popularity and acceptance of Sufism. Discriminate between different sectors of traditionalism. Encourage those with greater affinity to modernism, such as the Hanafi school, which goes to show she doesn't know anything about the Hanafi school at all. Encourage them to issue religious opinions and popularize these to weaken the authority of backward Wahhabi-inspired religious rulings. This relates to funding, and she goes on and on. Anyway, these are the sorts of advice that is being given. Now, this might seem like wishful thinking to some people, but if you look around you at the moment at the entire spectrum of activity, from Indonesia to Morocco, the entire Muslim world is being held at ransom for 9/11. Secular governments and communities living in Muslim communities living in secular countries around the world are now being manipulated into conducting what I can only describe as cosmetic reformation and changes to their systems in areas that have absolutely no relevance to terrorism whatsoever. The only relevance is that this underlying assumption that Islam is the cause of terrorism and it must therefore be brought into line by force. What relevance is there to terrorism between the relationship? What relevance can one see between the rules of talaq, the rules of divorce, and terrorism and 9/11? Yet, governments around the world, people are being asked to draw up documents. This long-term plan needs examples in order to set the ball rolling. So this is what they've set out on a course now to do. These examples will set the ball rolling for a full-scale reformation. Ms. Bonard's civil Islam appears to have inspired now an Islam called Hadri in Malaysia, and deformulation in Indonesia and in other countries with large Muslim minorities. Now, this may seem like wishful thinking, as I said, but apart from newspaper articles and television programs and books, there's an increasing presence of people with Muslim names who has taken on the job of criticizing Islam and creating doubt about the Quran, which is something Ms. Bonard is particularly keen to do also, because they're very keen to create distance between you and the Quran. Now, the plan is not only on paper. This is something that we should know, that the plan is not only on paper. The author, Ms. Bonard, has recently been given a hefty grant to further the plan through the design and funding of projects for the Muslim youth. It is called the RAND Initiative for Middle Eastern Youth. They describe it as the combined research and outreach effort geared towards the Greater Middle East's next generation. And I emphasize the word next generation.